everyone, welcome to the Christ Pearls channel. This is Jessica, and today I'm picking up where we left off in our marriage motif study in the presentation entitled The Best Is Yet to Come, Prepare Ye for the Coming of the Bridegroom. In the last video, we talked a little bit about some ways that we can use the marriage motif to look at some of the symbolism in the temple. And I'll just go back and skim through these slides so that you can kind of remember what we were talking about. But I thought of a few different changes that had occurred in the temple since about 2019. It's really been since President Nelson has been the prophet that some very significant changes had occurred, and the temple has changed many times since it began and has had many different iterations, all emphasizing different things. And, there's always talk about things like this when it happens. Some of that talk can be very critical or negative. Others can be very positive. And just as an example to show how this marriage motif can be used as a lens for not just the scriptures and trying to understand the covenant relationship with Jesus Christ and, maybe some of the second coming parables, but it can also be used just to analyze what's happening in the world and specifically in the church, and with regard to even just things like temple changes, the changes to the rituals in the temple. And so just as sort of a demonstration, I chose a few things that have stood out to me as being significant changes in the temple. I'm sure that you can think of other things and other ways to apply this motif, even to just the symbolism on the temple buildings themselves. And there's so much symbolism in the temple. I have a whole book about it that I really love. And this motif is just such a useful tool. And that's one thing that I'm hoping to demonstrate by using these things as examples. So in the last video, we went through an example of some structural change that we saw with regard to how we're engaging in these covenant rituals in the temple. So there were some changes to the temple drama where we see like a structure change. And then we also have seen changes with regard to the clothing, not utilizing certain types of clothing changes as part of the ritual. And so we looked at what the clothing can mean and symbolize, just to help us understand maybe what the changes mean and what they could symbolize. Because it's easy to say that, well, they're just trying to hurry, they're trying to make it shorter, it's a hastening of the work. And I think that there's some truth to that. I definitely feel that, and I'm happy about that, because I have a lot of ancestors and relatives who I would like to do temple work for, and it just feels so daunting because I have hundreds of names. But one thing that I think has helped me to understand some of these changes to the ritual, because the ritual is so rich and symbolic and beautiful, and you can learn so much from it. So when you see things getting cut out, sometimes it can be a little bit disheartening, because you're like, oh, I really liked that part of the ritual. And it can feel like some of that symbolism or that learning is getting lost. But for that reason, I started thinking about it through the lens of the marriage motif, and I was able to gain a little bit of understanding. And I wanted to share that lens with you guys so that maybe when you go to the temple, you can just try to apply the lens and see what the Spirit teaches you. And I have little suggestions in here of things that it's kind of taught me. And this isn't to make a statement of fact. It's really just an observation about just some of the little things that I've noticed with the symbolism, and help me to see that maybe there's a deeper meaning here, and maybe it does have a lot to do with the second coming and the things that President Nelson has been saying. So think about that in your mind as we go through this last of these three changes that have occurred recently. So remember, we talked a little bit about how these changes may suggest a point where there was a lot of spiritual preparation happening. Maybe it ties in with the preparation period of the arusin or betrothal stage or phase of the Hebrew wedding tradition versus like the spiritual readiness phase, or the readiness to enter into the ceremony and fulfill the covenant. And so we looked at some examples of how the changes maybe are making some suggestions to this effect or for this idea. And this is with regard to the structural changes in how we're participating in these covenants with our actions, and also with the clothing that we wear as part of the ritual, like how we're incorporating clothing or not incorporating it into the ritual, and just maybe some ideas about how that suggests a change from preparation to readiness, or from that arusin betrothal, like separation phase of the marriage motif or the Hebrew wedding tradition, to that point where we need to be ready because this ceremony is about to happen. And so these are just some of the slides that we went through. We looked at this idea of robes and shoes. We talked a little bit about a shoe ceremony that meant not just that. I think most people are familiar with this one in Exodus, where like if you put off your shoes when you're entering into a holy place. We talked in with regard to the Hebrew marriage motif that anciently people would take their shoes off when they come into a house, and that seems to be pretty common knowledge. Not everybody knows about in Ruth this transaction that Boaz does when he's trying to help Naomi and Ruth, and this transaction has to do with land. And so it relates a little bit to the idea of land of inheritance, because that's what it is about in the story of Ruth. And so this comes from a paper, and I've included this. I've covered the paper a little bit in the Hebrew wedding tradition playlist that I have, and I think it was in the end of the third video, like the very end of it. And that's just a really raw notes video where I was literally just sharing my notes and going through them and talking at length about them and the things that I had been studying. And then this presentation I've pulled from all of that to get to this nice, neater presentation. But we talked about just all of this symbolism that has to do with changing of clothing, and how this symbolizes an ascension and a progression, similar to the progression that we do in the temple. And so when we see these rituals changing, we could look at it as purely administrative or purely practical. But it's also possible, and I think that I saw this as I started to look through the lens of this marriage motif, that it's more than just administrative or functional types of changes that we're seeing. They could actually have a deeper meaning. So with regard to veils, we're going to get into some veil symbolism now, and hopefully this will be fun. I had fun studying this. So similar to these other changes, veils can also signify a state of preparation versus a state of readiness. And in the temple, we've seen some changes with regard to the veils. So the actions that we used to have incorporated into our ritual, where we used the veil as a covering, is no longer at play in the temple ritual. That has now been changed to where we still wear veils, but we just don't incorporate the veil into the ritual anymore as a covering over our face like we used to. And there was a certain point in the temple where we would cover our faces and use that as part of the ritual. But now, since we don't do that anymore, I had to stop and ask why we're not doing that, because it didn't really seem to have much to do with time or hastening or anything like that in terms of trying to get temple work done. But it did seem to have some symbolic ritual meaning. And I felt like I found a little bit of meaning there through this marriage motif because of what the unveiling symbolizes. So back when Jacob married Rachel, remember how Laban swapped out Rachel and Leah? He was able to do that because, according to legend, he initially, the Hebrews initially, they would have the bride remain veiled all the way to the end of the ceremony, and then at the end of the ceremony, there would be this unveiling as they're preparing to go into the wedding chamber. Well, as legend goes, because of what happened with Jacob and Leah and Rachel, they changed the ritual to where the unveiling would happen right before the ceremony began. So that's why in Jacob's story, he didn't realize that he had just married Leah until the unveiling. But then once that happened, in the Jewish legends and tradition, they say that that was what triggered the change. So going forward from the time of Leah and Jacob's marriage, from that time forward, they started doing the unveiling right before the ceremony. And I'm just noting that because I don't remember if I said that in that video. I did in my big long playlist, but that was a detail that helped me understand that there were some changes back then, and this may speak to the idea of the unveiling with regard to the second coming as well, like the veil over the earth, or the unveiling of the bride, which is what we're going to be talking about. So veils in the temple symbolize separation, preparation, humility, commitment. This veil that we used to have in terms of looking at the veil as a symbol for preparation, I think can symbolize an intermediary, like a separation between us and the divine, a hidden knowledge or truth, a veiled revelation and power. It can symbolize like the idea of spoon feeding or milk versus meat, like that change in progression. It can also symbolize a hidden glory or a veiled identity. Remember when we talked about Joseph in Egypt and how he had a veiled identity, and Moses did too. And we'll talk a little bit about Moses coming up. We'll get into his story a little bit more. So this could be some ways to think of the veil through the lens of the marriage motif. And then if you think about a change from this preparation phase of the Hebrew wedding tradition, or the aruzin or betrothal stage, to the kiddushin, or the actual ceremony when the covenant contract will be fulfilled, then you can think of how collectively we as the church are the bride, so the bride may be prepared to meet her Lord, to consummate their union and begin the work of bringing forth the child Zion. Like think of Revelation chapter 12 and maybe the fulfillment of that. And then the removal of actions using the veil may be a way of saying that the bride, the church, men and women together, no longer need any outward sign of humility or commitment because they're fully empowered to receive revelation and interact with the divine. So it's removing like a layer of separation. The change might be a step toward creating a greater sense of unity and uniformity in temple worship, a Zion people, by eliminating a former distinction between men and women. It may indicate an era of greater revelation where previously hidden truths and powers are now being unveiled to all members of the church, or the church's identity to the world. And I think if you look back at a couple of talks, like for example, I can think of off the top of my head in 2023, it would have been the October conference, Elder Neil L. Anderson had said the church is out of obscurity. And then if you think of the October 2024 General Conference, Gary E. Stevenson, when he was talking about this coming decade of 2024 to 2034, he talked about it as though this would be a great opportunity for the world to see the light that the church is in the lives of its members, and that we would really truly fulfill the idea of what it means to be an ensign to the nations. And so when he talked about this, I immediately thought of the church being this woman, this bride, adorned and ready and prepared for the bridegroom, and then the veil over her face being lifted, and all the world seeing her glory and her beauty and her light. And I don't know, it kind of made me think of the people of the earth being like the 10 virgins, even just there at the wedding and seeing this beautiful church about to be married to her bridegroom. And it was just weird how thinking of things through this motif actually helped me to personify the ideas that I see in the scriptures. And I had maybe like an Isaiah experience, because Isaiah tends to personify ideas, and he utilizes characters to tell a narrative of like the whole plan of salvation and this whole end time context to that plan. And so I felt like seeing through this motif helped me to be able to do that to some degree in my little immature way. Not as poetic maybe, but yeah, the church's identity being unveiled to the world, the world maybe seeing the church for what it really truly is, the Lord's people. And it could also be a spiritual protection and a veiling, so to speak, of ritual experiences to shelter the unprepared or less spiritually mature from receiving beyond what they're ready to receive and understand. And I thought about this last one more in connection with some of the critiques and criticisms that I've seen and heard from people when they're upset or disappointed about something in the ritual changing. I mean, I've seen people be upset about the fact that we don't really incorporate the veiling as a covering of our faces in the ritual anymore. Some people have been really upset about that. And I can see why, because there's so much rich symbolism. And if you are somebody who loves to study symbolism, which I do, so I can identify with that feeling, then it can be a little disappointing on some level, I think. Although for me personally, I have this kind of extra caveat to my feelings, which is that I'm trying to do work for other people. That's the whole point of me going to the temple. And, I go to be able to receive revelation for myself too, but my primary purpose is service, because I have so many people in my family that I want to bring the covenants of the gospel to in the spirit world. And so that's why I go to the temple. So I feel like I'm more focused outwardly when I go to the temple than I am inwardly. And so I tend to think more of the people that I'm serving when I'm there and what they need more than what I need. And so for me, it doesn't feel as sad in that train of thought, because I feel like, well, I'm here to serve. And that's the most important thing. That's the most important reason that I'm here. So this image is of Moses veiling and unveiling his face. And this story provides a lot of context for the idea of veils, particularly veils in the temple. The veil is steeped in symbolism like crazy in the scriptures, especially for Latter-day Saints. We have a lot of understanding about veils that I think is unique. The veil points to layered themes of separation, identity, revelation, protection, glory, atonement, and the path back to God's presence. In both ancient and modern religious traditions, the veils often symbolized a barrier between the divine and the mortal, or between God and his people. In the temple context, the veil is seen as symbolic of spiritual preparation and separation or progression. And it can be passed through to enter God's presence. So we have to go through the veil, kind of like in the temple. We go through the veil symbolically as a symbol of entering into God's presence. When we Consider the tearing of the veil in the New Testament. This was a dramatic symbol of Christ removing the barrier between God and his people, granting them access, direct access to God through his atonement. Matthew 27:51 says, "And behold, the veil of the temple was rent in twain from the top to the bottom." This event occurred at the moment of Christ's death and is symbolic of the end of spiritual separation. The tearing of the veil indicated that all people, not just high priests, could now approach God directly. Consider the bridal chamber, the tearing of the hymen, the intimacy ritual between the bride and the bridegroom that seals the deal, so to speak. In the scriptures, particularly in the New Testament, for example, 2 Corinthians 3:14 through 16, Paul speaks of the veil that Moses wore as a shield that hid the full glory of God from the Israelites. He then states that through Christ the veil is removed, allowing for clearer access to the truth and to God. Applied to the temple through the marriage motif lens, the change in ritual to no longer use the veil as a covering could symbolize a higher, holier status, a prepared status. If women are seen as representing the woman, the bride, the church collectively. This change could suggest that there's no longer a need for symbolic barriers between the church and God, pointing to an equal partnership with men and women of the church joined together in accessing spiritual power and understanding. So 2 Corinthians 3:14 through 16 says, "But their minds were blinded, for until this day remaineth the same veil untaken away in the reading of the Old Testament, which veil is done away in Christ. But even unto this day, when Moses is read, the veil is upon their heart. Nevertheless, when it shall turn to the Lord, the veil shall be taken away." So here we see this idea of the veil representing hidden knowledge and a separation between understanding and not understanding. For consideration, here's a list of points to ponder on allegorical symbols connected to the veil. So Christ as the veil is one that we've talked about. Christ is the mediator between us and God. The veil separating the holy place from the Holy of Holies in the ancient temple is symbolically torn at his death, like we just touched on, representing Christ's role as the passageway back into God's presence. He's the veil through which we must pass to enter the divine. And it's interesting too, because they used to go up to the temple and kind of move through, and we still kind of do that, but anciently having this high priest be the one to have to go in, it added an extra layer of separation. The high priest was this intermediary. So think back to that idea of the structural changes of how we're doing these covenant rituals in the temple, and think about that in connection with this idea. When Jesus completed the atonement and died on the cross, and then the veil was rent in the temple, this was a sign of change, and there no longer needing to be a high priest between the people and the Holy of Holies and God. And so if that was a change back then what could these changes now mean for us today? I mean, are we not still trying to progress and become that bride adorned for the bridegroom? Prior to Jehovah's mortal ministry, the high priest was the only one allowed to enter the Holy of Holies. After Christ fulfilled his divine mission, he became the veil. And now, instead of a high priest coming down through the temple, we go up. Consider how Satan worked tirelessly to stop the Lord from coming down to us prior to his birth by seeking to wipe out the covenant lineage. Now Satan works tirelessly to prevent us from going up to the Lord. And he does everything he can to keep people from going to the temple. I mean, For whatever reason, even stupid things like garments not fitting as comfortably as somebody likes is enough to keep someone away from the temple. The veiling and unveiling of Moses. So Moses' veiled face represents the holiness that comes from direct interaction with God. Moses' veiling his face after encountering God signifies the divine glory that mortal eyes are unprepared for, much like the temple veil shielding the Holy of Holies. Additionally, Moses removing the veil represents times when he reveals divine truth to the people, paralleling Christ revealing the way to God. Moses' infancy and the bulrush veil. The woven bulrushes that concealed baby Moses in the Nile symbolize a protective veil that shields him from danger, while also hiding his true identity, similar to Joseph of Egypt. This connects to the idea that God's purposes and chosen servants may be hidden or veiled from the world until the appointed time for their mission. This may harken back to Adam and Eve and the coats of light or the protective skins that the Lord made for them. This may also remind us of Noah's protective ark. Joseph's veiled identity in Egypt. We talked a little bit about this in the previous videos where we discussed his story. But like the veil in the temple, Joseph's Egyptian identity veiled him from his brothers who couldn't recognize him as their Israelite brother. This symbolism of hidden identity can be connected to Christ's role as a figure who, though divine, came in a way that many did not recognize, particularly symbolizing the hidden nature of divine truth and power in mortality. So here's a little bit more about the bulrushes. Exodus 2:3. I've got two different translations here. The KJV says, "And when she could not longer hide him, she took him for an ark of bulrushes and daubed it with slime and with pitch, and put the child therein, and she laid it in the flags by the river's brink." And then the NLT, which is the New Living Translation, it says, "But when she could no longer hide him, she got a basket made of papyrus reeds and waterproofed it with tar and pitch. She put the baby in the basket and laid it among the reeds along the bank of the Nile River." That one's just a little easier to understand. So here's a little bit more on the bulrushes. This is just a quote that I found as I was studying and kind of looking at what different scholars have said. A small basket made of papyrus reeds and waterproofed with bituminous materials. The term is used in the Bible only of the ark made for the infant Moses, in which he was floated on the Nile in order to escape detection by the Egyptians. It is generally agreed that the bulrush mentioned was the papyrus plant, which, though not now found in the lower Nile, grew there abundantly in antiquity. The Hebrew word is, and I don't know how to say it in Hebrew, but it's thought to have the root meaning to swallow or to absorb, which accords with its use for the swamp reed. The biblical usage also agrees with what is known of the uses made of papyrus reed and of its natural environment, for example, boat construction and abundance of water. Only the Ark of Bulrushes and Noah's Ark are called by the name Tebah, which is possibly an Egyptian loanword for box or coffin. The usual word in Hebrew for box or for the Ark of the Covenant being Aaron. No description is given of the shape or construction of the ark, except that it was daubed with waterproofing substances, himar, and zaphet, or bitumen and pitch. It was made with some sort of cover over the top, which, even if the general shape was that of the papyrus boats of the Nile, could account for the name ark rather than vessel. as these boats are called in Isaiah 18:2. Keel and Delish, I'm not sure how to say the name, suggests that ark was used to indicate the similarities in shape and purposes to Noah's ark. But depending on the origin and usage of the word tabah, the connection could be the other way around. Either way, the association would be appropriate to the unique significance of these two craft. So this is where they're making a connection in like a textual analysis or a linguistic analysis to link this little boat that Moses' mom made to put him in with the ark that Noah built. It serves the same purpose. It's using similar language. These ideas are connected. So Paul's explanation of the veil, which is 2 Corinthians 3:13-18, Paul discusses the veil over Moses' face as representing a lack of spiritual understanding that remains over Israel. This symbolism suggests that spiritual insights and divine truths are veiled until individuals seek and accept Christ, who lifts the veil of unbelief, so that hidden knowledge can be revealed. So think about that for just a minute. Think about the temple and the idea of no longer covering our faces with the veil. And think about it maybe in connection with the idea of hidden knowledge being revealed. Consider the wealth and breadth of scriptural knowledge that is now available with the tap of a finger. Ancient learning came by way of ritual practice. And while that's still helpful, the most basic concepts and symbols related to Christ and the temple, for example, are accessible to anyone with internet access. If we lack understanding of symbolism, perhaps we act as our own veil if we do not search the scriptures diligently. And so the reason that I put this little note here is because this goes back to that fifth idea that I mentioned in the previous slide, where sometimes I think these changes where we're seeing some ritual removed from the temple, it may not just be about trying to hurry and get temple work done, although I think that's probably the main reason. That's just my opinion. It's a feeling that I get when I listen to the brethren and when I see the amount of temple work that needs to be done. I mean, I have hundreds of names on an endowment list. The endowment is always the bottleneck for getting temple work done. And so I do feel like that is one reason, but I think another reason could be that there are people who, even though we have so much power with the tap of our finger to be able to learn and understand this symbolism, there are just so many who don't take the time and the opportunity. I mean, people would rather scroll Instagram and TikTok than, spend time doing probably like this boring stuff that I'm doing right now. And there was a time in my life where I didn't have time to do this, but I do now, and I have the desire, and that's why I'm doing it, because I want to know. But I think that desire needs to be there. And so I think that sometimes maybe these changes of, like the criticism of saying, well, we're watering down the temple ritual, we're not really maximizing what we can learn. Maybe that's because we've moved into a stage where the preparation time is over and we should be prepared and we should be ready. So we're moving out of that arusin or betrothal phase of our relationship as a covenant bride of Christ, collectively as the church, to a new phase where we need to be ready for this ceremony because it's about to happen. And if we have not already done our due diligence of learning through ritual practice and coupling that with deep, deep scripture study, then we've acted as our own veil and we've prevented ourselves from accessing the divine and the hidden knowledge that could be revealed to us even now. And so that was kind of one of those I don't know, revelations, I guess you could say, that I felt as I thought about the temple and have been going to the temple and just thinking about this whole motif and trying to organize this all into this presentation. And I've been working on this for so long now, and I've thought about so many different little details, it's actually hard to condense it. And that's why I shared all my raw notes and that other playlist, because it is hard to get all of it into one presentation. But this is why I think we have to pay the price. We have to spend the time. Because if we do, the Lord will reward us with this hidden knowledge being revealed. He'll lift the veil. And I want the veil lifted for me. I want to see things as they really are and as they really will be. So the veil can also be a symbol of the body. In Hebrews, Paul describes Christ's flesh as the veil, torn to allow access to the Holy of Holies. Christ's sacrifice broke the barriers of death and sin, granting covenant people access to the divine presence, represented by going beyond the veil in the temple. And that's in Hebrews 10:20. The bridal veil in covenantal marriage is an important symbol too. This can be connected with the bride of Christ symbolism for the most obvious reason, where the bridal veil lifted during marriage signifies entering a covenant relationship in a new phase of unity where the promise given at the betrothal becomes solemnized or sealed. Theologically, the bridal veil is tied to the temple's symbolism, where passing through the veil represents covenant fulfillment and a spiritual marriage of complete unity with Christ, at one, body and soul. So that true at-one-ment or atonement will be able to be fulfilled when that covenant fulfillment occurs, when the Lord actually comes to collect his bride. And we see this concept illustrated in a ritual embrace and in the exchange of veiled language that exerts covenantal power to open the portal through the veil to the divine. So think about the temple ritual and how when you get to like the climax of the temple, when you finally get to, ascend through the temple, if you've ever done a temple endowment where you actually get to move from room to room, then that symbol becomes even more, I think, real and tangible, because you actually physically are moving through the temple. And even now we have oftentimes where you can go from one room to like upstairs to a veil. It depends on what temple you're in. But just think about that idea of moving up. And then when you get there and you engage in this like ritual embrace, and you're having this exchange of veiled language that exerts covenantal power, like a key to open the portal through the veil to the divine. That's the idea. When you go to the temple next time, think of it in connection with the marriage motif, with the idea of the bride of Christ symbolism and the veil being lifted, and you get to embrace the Lord. So he lifts the veil and then he grabs you and he embraces you. Alma's use of veil language. Alma's discourse to his son Corianton in Alma 42:11 through 23 about God's justice and mercy describes the need for a curtain of understanding, suggesting that divine justice and mercy are veiled mysteries that become understandable through Christ's atonement. This speaks to the idea of veiled language, intending to veil the mysteries of God that are centered on an understanding of Jesus Christ in an effort to balance justice and mercy. So again, this kind of goes back to what we're spiritually prepared for. And, if you think about the stumbling block that the Jews experienced at the time of Jesus Christ during his mortal ministry, they had this curtain over the eyes of their understanding, this veil, because they just couldn't see Jesus Christ for who he was, the Savior, the great Jehovah. They just couldn't see it. And there are so many different reasons for that all kind of factor in and kind of merge with each other to create this huge stumbling block. But it didn't have to be there. And I think this goes back to paying the price, to trying to understand, to really truly seeking Jesus. The veil is also a symbol of mortal limitations. The veil not only divides, but also represents the limitations of mortality in perceiving God's full glory. For now we see through a glass darkly, but then face to face, says 1 Corinthians 13:12. Only through Christ's redemptive work can these veils, like physical and spiritual death, for example, be lifted, providing covenant people with a complete realization of their divine heritage and potential for glory. So I feel like this is one of those things that I still struggle with. I mean, I think we're all still trying to see through a glass darkly. I mean, that is the mortal experience. We have these mortal eyes. They're limited. We're kind of hindered by our physical bodies in some ways. It's really strange because when you think about when a spirit and a body are separated, and then the scriptures talking about how, is it section 138, where we get into the whole like spirits on the other side that Wilford Woodruff had the vision of. And it's the idea that there's like a, I don't know, like a dissatisfaction with being separated from the body. It's like the spirit longs to be with the body, and the body needs the spirit to be alive. And I think that this happens both ways. It's like on one hand, with this mortal telestial body, we can feel weighed down by it, and it seems like the spirit is more free to have like some kind of power and maybe rest without the body. But then on the other hand, without the body, the spirit is also limited in what it can achieve. And so there's like this very weird kind of, I don't know, I guess you could call it like a contrary happening here, where it's like seeing through this glass darkly through the body. In one way, it can feel so like difficult and like you're straining and it's hard. But on the other hand, it's like without like a perfect body, a perfect resurrected body, the spirit is so limited. And even though when you get to the other side of the veil, you can see more clearly, now you have this other issue of, well, I don't have my body. And I always think about this when I go to the temple a lot, because I'm thinking about the people who I'm going to the temple for. And I'm feeling, I think many times, things that they're feeling. And it occurs to me that there is this sense of a longing to be back with the body, and a gratitude that I feel sometimes that somebody is grateful that I'm there doing the work for them. And so these ideas come to my mind sometimes when I'm there about how, that the veil, it also represents the limitations of mortality, and as well as the part of the mortal sojourn that includes the spirit world, because the mortality includes the time in the spirit world. I mean, this is all part of our second estate until we reach that third estate. And so anyway, these are just some of those ideas that I've thought of in connection with the veil that I don't think I could have seen until I started digging really deep into this specific marriage motif. So another example would be like the veiling of divine knowledge. We talked a little bit about this. things like prophetic dreams and visions, including those of Lehi, Daniel, John the Revelator. So not just knowledge in terms of like personal revelation, but even just the symbolic language of some of these visions that are already recorded for us. Like we can have a veil over our understanding on even these things, like the book of Revelation. That it's like veiled knowledge, but it becomes unveiled as you start to understand the symbolism. So like John the Revelator specifically, his whole vision is presented with like all of this veiled or symbolic language. And Isaiah's book is this way too. The imagery represents layers of divine truth that are only revealed gradually as one draws nearer to God and to an understanding of that symbolism that God is using. And, think about the word apocalypse. It comes from the Greek word meaning revealed or uncovered. And so this gives you a sense of that, like, hidden knowledge, this veiled or symbolic language that's hiding knowledge. So if we look at some apocryphal, pseudepigraphical veil symbolism, I think it just expands the mind and helps us see that this idea of veils is not just in our canon, but it's also in other extra biblical texts that kind of, I think in some ways, help validate the theology and the symbolism that specifically we as Latter-day Saints understand about the plan of salvation and the idea of ascending and covenants and moving along the covenant path from one state of progression to another, the idea of the ladder, Jacob's ladder, Isaiah's ladder. I feel like as I dig into these extra biblical texts, I see it a lot. So the veiling of Enoch in the book of Enoch was pretty interesting. In Enoch 1, Enoch is taken up or translated where he witnesses heavenly things that are veiled from mortals. The heavenly realms are hidden behind layers of knowledge, understanding, and vision, which only someone like Enoch, who's chosen and prepared and is able to access this, can see. The symbolism of the layers reflects the idea that divine truths are hidden until one reaches spiritual readiness or worthiness. So again, this is where I'm kind of getting this idea of maybe these changes suggest more of this moving from the phase of preparation and betrothal to a state of readiness for the actual ceremony and that reunion with the bridegroom. 1 Enoch 14, 8 through 25 describes Enoch's vision of the heavenly temple hidden from mortals and accessible only to him. A little snippet from that says, "And the vision appeared to me as follows. Behold, clouds in the vision called me, and mist summoned me. And the course of the stars and the lightnings sped and hastened me, and the winds in the vision caused me to fly." The imagery of clouds, mists, and winds reflects a veiling of heavenly realms only accessible through divine guidance. The veiling of wisdom in the Wisdom of Solomon. This apocryphal text describes divine wisdom as hidden from the world and veiled in a mystery. Wisdom depicted as a figure remains concealed until the seeker humbles themselves and earnestly seeks God. This aligns with the temple veil, which separates sacred knowledge until individuals are prepared for deeper insight and revelation, echoing the concept that wisdom herself is unveiled through a process of spiritual growth. And the reason I put herself is because this word wisdom is a feminine word. It implies like a feminine persona. So Wisdom of Solomon 6:22 through 23 speaks of wisdom as hidden or veiled. It says, "As for wisdom, I will tell you and will not hide mysteries from you, but will trace her course from the beginning." So do you see how wisdom is taking on this female personification. This verse suggests that wisdom is concealed until the seeker is ready, aligning with temple symbolism of veiled understanding until the covenant path is completed and solemnized or sealed. So in studying the priesthood, I've done a couple of videos on this, but there's one video that I did called The Ancient Covenant Restored, and another video I did that is called The Elias Puzzle. And these two videos talk a lot about the Abrahamic covenant, about the keys that were received in the Kirtland Temple, and about who the first Elias was, which appears to be Noah, and the idea of what Elias does. He restores the discipline of the covenant path. Joseph Smith explained the difference between Elias and Elijah as Elias is the one who gathers all the stones, brings them in through the gate, gets them all there ready to use in a pile. And then Elijah, he's the cement. So with Elias's work, we're getting through the gate, getting all these stones gathered, and we can start stacking them or organizing people into families. And then we need that cement to seal all of these bricks or stones to build this beautiful temple. So he uses this like construction analogy, and the reason I'm bringing this up is because I think when we're thinking about the covenant path and how everything we do at some point has to be solemnized or sealed, this is where my mind always goes back to the difference between the work of Elias and the work of Elijah, or the keys of Elias and the keys of Elijah. And they go hand in hand. You can't really have one without the other. And I think that this also speaks to the idea of spiritual preparation and spiritual readiness. You know, when we're preparing, we're still in that building phase. But when we've got everything like stacked up and ready, then we need to cement it all together. And that's the readiness phase. The veil of Jacob's ladder in Genesis and the ladder of Jacob in the ladder of Jacob, the concept of Jacob's ladder in both Genesis and the pseudepigraphical ladder of Jacob symbolizes a veil between heaven and earth. Jacob's vision reveals angels ascending and descending between worlds, hinting at divine access through revelation and covenant. This can mirror temple symbolism, where ascent through covenants with Christ represents passing through veils to draw closer to God's presence until we reach our heavenly home. And remember in the previous videos, there was one where we looked at birth and rebirth, and we got into this concept of passing through the veil of mortality, or the veil of forgetfulness into mortality, and even passing through the veil physically, like through our mother's body into the world. There's just so much symbolism there that is associated with this concept of progression and ascending up a ladder of progression. And Genesis 28:12 describes Jacob's ladder, while the ladder of Jacob expands on this imagery. So Genesis says, "And he dreamed, and behold, a ladder set up on the earth, and the top of it reached to heaven, and behold, the angels of God ascending and descending on it." Jacob's vision represents a path between the divine and mortal realms, veiled from ordinary sight and accessible only through revelation. You can compare it to Isaiah's spiritual ladder. Adam and Eve's fig leaf covering as a veil. So if we look at the book of Genesis and then also at the apocryphal writing, this extra biblical literature called Life of Adam and Eve, we can see this same concept. After their transgression, Adam and Eve covered themselves with fig leaves, symbolizing the first veil of mortality. In the life of Adam and Eve, in apocryphal expansion, the garments become a physical reminder of their new mortal condition and separation from God's presence, as well as a covering of protection to symbolize Jesus and his infinite love and atonement, hesed and kafar. Hesed is this loving kindness, and kafar is to cover. This parallels temple symbolism where the veil represents mortal life's conditions and the separation from Eden or the presence of God, which only Christ can bridge. And this is another analogy for marriage that I think helps to, like, if you've ever read the old book by Stephen E. Robinson, he has an old Ensign article entitled this too, but it's called Believing Christ. He uses a marriage analogy to help us understand the atonement. And it really, truly is, I think, the best analogy for understanding our covenant relationship. He kind of gets more into dollars and cents and approaches it kind of in a practical way, I think, because it's written for young people. But really, if you think about the relationship between husband and wife, and what we're really trying to achieve is this concept of hesed and kafar for each other. And I think it gets more intimate and deep than just we're merging our bank accounts and I have, all these liabilities and Jesus has all these infinite assets and he can cover all of my liabilities. And as we merge and become this couple and I take on his name and we merge our bank accounts, mine is in the positive now because we've got a joint account. I mean, that's the analogy that Stephen E. Robinson uses, and it is a marriage analogy, and it is a good one. And it really helped me when I was like 16, and I felt like I needed that at the time. But thinking about it in this really intimate way is just changing how I feel about the church and the gospel, even the living prophet, and especially the temple. Genesis 3:7, for the fig leaves and the life of Adam and Eve, 20, for further symbolism. So this is what we're going to be looking at. And the eyes of them both were opened, and they knew that they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves aprons. And remember, the fig leaves had all this other symbolism attached to it in connection with the second coming, with the covenant, with Adam and Eve, the whole concept of what the fig leaves can do. This initial covering after the fall represents separation from God's presence, similar to the temple veil's separation of the sacred from the profane. But it also symbolizes Jesus Christ's atonement. Veils in the vision of Isaiah, the ascension of Isaiah. The ascension of Isaiah, a pseudepigraphical text, describes the prophet Isaiah being lifted through several heavens. We talked a little bit about this one. Each heaven has its own veil of separation through which Isaiah must pass before approaching God. The imagery of passing through successive veils or levels toward God represents the concept of spiritual progression, closely related to Latter-day Saint temple symbolism of moving through stages or levels on the way to God's presence. And this is something that I think is really unique to Latter-day Saints because there really aren't a lot of temple ritual religions these days. I mean, there are a couple, but what I really love about the temple is this idea of ascension. And seeing it in scripture is something that I feel like I'm able to do more now that I've been studying this motif. Like I feel like I see it everywhere. Like it's almost impossible not to see it. And that's why I have so many scripture references and extra biblical references in this presentation, is because just the more I come across things and I'm just like, wow, this is here it's in this too. And it just seems like it's everywhere. Ascension of Isaiah 7, 8 through 10, where Isaiah ascends through various heavenly levels. One little snippet from that says, "And he carried me up into the seventh heaven, and there was a throne in the midst, and on the right and on the left were 4 presences." Each heaven is described as a separate space, veiled until Isaiah is worthy, akin to the temple's layered approach to sacred knowledge. And this is really similar to Enoch's experience. Enoch and Isaiah seem to go through the same experience, and Isaiah actually sees Enoch in his experience, which we did talk about in a previous video. The veiling of Tobias in the book of Tobit. In Tobit, Tobias is protected from demonic powers and guided by the angel Raphael, which keeps him shielded or veiled from harm. This veiling protection mirrors the idea that in sacred spaces like the temple, individuals are symbolically shielded from the world's evils as they seek divine presence. This protective aspect of veiling can be related to the armor of God theme, where veils or sacred garments serve as a form of divine protection. Tobit 6, 1 through 7 is where Tobias is guided by Raphael. And a little blurb from that says, "So they went on together, and the young man said to the angel, 'Brother Azarias, what medicine is there in the heart, the liver, and the gall of the fish?'" Tobias is veiled in divine protection, shielded from demonic forces through his obedience and the guidance of Raphael in this experience. And it's a little bizarre, the story, but it's very similar to what Enoch and Isaiah are experiencing, where he's kind of like moving from one space or state to another. And he's being guided and protected as he does this. And he has to be ready to move from one space to the next. The Ark of the Covenant's cover as a veil. So for this, we can look at Exodus and also the book of Jubilees. The mercy seat or cover of the ark in the tabernacle served as a form of veil, as described in the book of Exodus and expounded in Jubilees. Only the high priest could approach it on Yom Kippur. This separation symbolized the idea that atonement, symbolized by the mercy seat, was needed to approach God's presence. The mercy seat represents the redemptive power of Christ's atonement, bridging the veil between God and humanity. Exodus 25:17 through 22, with context in Jubilees 6:16, help us to understand a little bit more about the bow in the cloud. "And thou shalt put the mercy seat above upon the ark, and there I will meet with thee, and I will commune with thee from above the mercy seat." The mercy seat acts as a symbolic veil, a place of divine communion and atonement, accessible only through sacred rites, similar to entering the Holy of Holies. The veil of mystery in the book of Secrets of Enoch. This is 2nd Enoch. 2nd Enoch, also called the book of Secrets of Enoch, contains the concept of hidden mysteries, described as being veiled or reserved until the righteous are ready. The layers of revelation only unfold as Enoch himself prepares spiritually, symbolizing that divine mysteries are concealed until one is spiritually prepared. This aligns with the view that deeper truths are revealed only to those who have progressed through temple covenants and personal righteousness. It relates to the ascension of Isaiah and both Isaiah's and Jacob's ladders. 2nd Enoch 22, 1 through 4 is where Enoch is brought to a hidden place of wisdom. "And I saw the 8th heaven, which is called in the Hebrew language Muzalath. I beheld the river of fire." Enoch's access to hidden realms symbolizes divine mysteries veiled from mortals, accessible only through progression and spiritual readiness. the veil of the heavenly temple and the testament of Levi. The testament of Levi, part of the testaments of the 12 patriarchs, contains visions of the heavenly temple with multiple veils and divisions. Levi's vision of the heavenly temple, like the earthly temple, symbolizes the separation between God and mortals, only accessible through priestly and sacred rites focused on the Lord. This reinforces the theme that the journey to God's presence is one of passing through veils or stages of holiness. Testament of Levi 5:1-2, describing Levi's vision of a heavenly temple with various veils. And I saw 7 men in white raiment, saying unto me, Arise, put on the robe of the priesthood and the crown of righteousness. Levi's vision of the heavenly temple with multiple layers or veils symbolizes stages of approach toward God's presence through purity and priesthood authority. And I really couldn't put a lot of verses from each of these stories in here because this is already taking so long. But I hope you're seeing that with each of these little blurbs that I'm highlighting, there's, like in this one, for example, we have the number 7, we have white raiment, we have arise, we have, put on the robe of the priesthood and the crown of righteousness. This one's probably one of the more obvious ones where you see all of this like temple language, this covenant language, and the idea of moving up and arising and your state of progression increasing to a higher level. And this is mostly what I think I'm seeing as I'm studying veils, is that veils represent this idea of progression, of passing through from one phase to another phase or one space to another space. Mary's veiling, and this is a hard word for me to say, but Mary's veiling in the Proto-Evangelium of James. The Proto-Evangelium of James, an apocryphal account, emphasizes Mary's upbringing in the temple where she's veiled and dedicated to God. I really liked this story, by the way. You can find it online if you want to read it. But I liked the idea of thinking of Mary as a little girl. So Mary, in this apocryphal text, she has this upbringing in the temple where she's veiled and dedicated to God. Her veiling symbolizes her consecration and separation from the world, a symbol paralleled in temple practices as a marker of holiness and divine dedication. And it has ties to the arusin or betrothal in the marriage motif. This act of veiling also symbolizes preparation for entering a holy covenant, analogous to temple ordinances. So in this Proto-Evangelium of James, chapter 7, verses 5-9, describe Mary's dedication in the temple. And the priest received her and kissed her and blessed her, saying, The Lord has magnified thy name in all generations. And Mary remained as if she were a dove that dwelt there, and received her food from the hand of an angel. Mary's veiling and dwelling in the temple signifies her dedication and separation for holy purposes, prefiguring the covenant relationship believers enter through temple covenants and worship. And I really liked this analogy. I'm just going to pause on it for a second so that you can think about it more. But think about Mary as a little girl being given to the temple and serving in the temple all through her upbringing. And then think about when we talked about Mary, how she's so humble and submissive. She knows and understands the plan that the Lord would be born, that she's willing to offer her body as a vessel for the Lord to come into the world, and she becomes the veil that he passes through. I mean, Jesus Christ literally is carried inside of her and nurtured his whole life, really, but particularly physically in the womb, and then he comes through the veil into the world through his mother Mary, And just think about this idea that she may have spent her entire life in preparation for this moment, passing from one veil in the temple to the next, so that she would be prepared for this special mission. So in the next video, we're going to get into this. I want to just look at Enoch's journey a little bit more. Since this video is already really long, I'm going to separate this into a follow-up. So in the next video, we'll talk about hidden knowledge, unveiled, and we'll look specifically at Enoch in his apocryphal texts. So that's all for this one. I hope you'll stick around for the next one. If you liked the video, please like it. And if you want more of these, hit the subscribe button. I'll be keeping this going until we get through all of these ideas. But that's all for this one.